I'm Priscilla.
And I'm Elise.
Welcome to Novel Feelings, where two psychologists take a deep dive into your favorite novels.
We are back. We are kicking off season 4 with a review of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. But just in case you missed our announcement episode, let's just quickly get you up to speed with what to expect for season 4.
This year, we're doing a read-along book club. It's a bit like what we did last year. This year?
Well, 2023.
Yeah. I have lost all sense of time. It's December.
December is like the Friday 4 p.m. of the year. No one can do anything. No one has any words or thoughts or brain cells left. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So we're doing a Herculean task here.
Very true.
Yes, so we're doing a read-along book club. We'll release an episode per book every 2 months. Expect an in-depth discussion about the mental health content of the book, neurodiversity, and other psychological themes. 2 sections, non-spoilers up first, and then we'll dive right into the spoiler sections in the second half.
Exactly. And a huge thank you to our book club partners, Amplify Bookstore. So Amplify is a bookstore dedicated to books by authors who are Black, Indigenous and or people of colour with the aim to diversify your bookshelf. You can purchase all of our book club picks in a convenient bundle or purchase them individually. They're generously offering 10% off to our listeners with the code NovelFeelings10.
And we would love to hear what you think. If you haven't already, join our Facebook group, Novel Feelings Community. We will host discussions about the books.
And check out our show notes for all links and disclaimers and keep up to date on our social media through @novel_feelings everywhere. But before we dive into the book review, hey, Priscilla, how would you rate your week on a 5-point scale?
I think I would rate it 3 out of 5 work from home days. I would say this week has been okay. It feels like it should have been my last week because it was quite relaxed. Like, you know how it feels when you're wrapping things up? But no, I still have 1 more week of work to go. And last I checked, I had 27 appointments next week.
Oh my God. That's so many. What's your average these days?
Well, I'm supposed to only book 17.
Oh God.
So
just end of the year.
This is me like preemptively making up for my long Christmas and New Year break.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And for the listeners, when are you heading off on your holiday?
The 28th of December. And then I'm off pretty much until the end of January. So yes, it's going to be a hectic last week of work trying to see everyone and get all the loose ends tied up. But then I will switch off.
Excellent.
Yes. What about you, Elise? How would you rate your week on a 5-point scale?
I'll also go 3 out of 5 Christmas catch-ups for me. So I feel like everything is very busy with socializing, but also just end of year work tasks. I'm very tired and kind of crawling to the end of the year. I only have a few more working days to go, thankfully. But yeah, I keep doing that thing where I say this is a January problem, this is a January problem, but at this rate, all of January is going to be a problem. So
No.
just got a lot of work things on my plate. So yeah, feeling the end of year burn at the moment. But otherwise, I'm okay.
Almost there.
Almost there.
Yeah.
Let's introduce you to the author of the book. So Gabrielle Zevin is a New York Times bestselling novelist whose books have been translated into 40 languages. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is her 10th novel. Gabrielle began her writing career at age 14 as a music critic and has occasionally written criticism for the New York Times NPR. She's also the screenwriter of Conversations with Other Women.
And let us tell you a little bit about Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
Should we just start calling it T3 or something like that? Because I feel like we'll stumble over ourselves if we keep trying to say that on the whole episode.
T3 moving forward. Yes. All right. So this is the story of Sam and Sadie. It's not a romance, but it is about love. When Sam catches sight of Sadie at a crowded train station one winter morning, he is catapulted back to the brief time they spent playing together as children. Their unique spark is instantly reignited. What comes next is a story of friendship and rivalry, fame and creativity, betrayal and tragedy, perfect worlds and imperfect ones, and ultimately our need to connect, to be loved, and to love. All right, so why did we choose this book, Elise?
This is probably one of my picks.
Mm.
So this is a really popular book. It only came out 2 years ago, but
Mm.
it's done extremely well. It's been Gabrielle Zevin's best-selling novel. It's particularly nostalgic for gamers, particularly those that were part of gaming culture in the 90s and early 2000s.
Mm.
I read this probably a year and a half or maybe almost 2 years ago, around the time of release, and I've been kind of desperate to talk about it. I had a really strong emotional reaction to this book when I first read it, and when I learned it was part of Amplify's catalogue, and sort of thought, it might have some good themes for us to discuss on the pod.
Mm.
I'll also mention here that I briefly met Gabrielle Zevin at a book event as part of the Melbourne Writers Festival at a
Mm.
signing. So it's not like it was, a
Yeah.
long conversation or anything. But continuing the theme of awkward interactions with authors at signings,
Mm-hmm.
flashback to our Patrick Ness episode where we talked about a monster calls in season 2. The conversation went something like this. I told her, I really love this book. I'm actually a psychologist, and I thought this book really, captures psychological themes well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're really good at writing the impacts of trauma on characters,
Mm-hmm.
something along those lines. And
Yeah.
she said, there's one of you at every signing. And I'm like,
What?
all right.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm not that unique.
Yes.
My
Good to
unique
know.
perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, she really just brought me right down to earth. Like, okay, yep, sure.
Yeah.
And then, we had like a little bit more than that, but that kind of just stuck with me of like, oh, the authors have really heard it all before, haven't they? Like, I'm not offering anything new here. Maybe I should just stick to the, I'm a big fan of your work. Enjoyed your talk kind of conversation.
Just awkwardly standing there. Love your work. Thank you.
Yep. Yep.
Oh,
Yeah. So one day I'll meet an author and it won't be awkward. Maybe. There's nothing like a one sentence comment from an author to kind of,
stab you in the heart.
stab you in the heart, deflate your ego, your purpose, just a little bit. Anyway, enough about me. What are we covering today?
We're covering depression, disability, gun violence a little bit, grief, and domestic violence. We would also quickly note that there's a mention of characters witnessing suicide, but we don't discuss this in detail. And there are other content notes that you can find in our show notes.
Yeah. And we did want to just flag a bit of a note on the author before we jump into the review today. So it was only after choosing the book for our book club that we learned about a few controversies surrounding Gabrielle Zevin, so we wanted to acknowledge them explicitly before we just dive into the review. The first controversy reacts to accusations of plagiarism. So we understand that one of the fictional games featured in the book, called Solution, was inspired by a real-life game called Train, created by Brenda Romero in 2009. Both games are themed around players being complicit in the Holocaust. While Solution is not a direct copy of this game, and it's also a fictional game that's embedded in a fictional novel, Zevin has acknowledged in interviews that she was inspired by the game, yet she does not credit Romero at all, which I guess is quite disappointing. Fictional authors don't always credit all of their sources of inspiration. However, Zevin does credit various video game developers in her acknowledgement, so it's, it doesn't sit very well that she left out this particular acknowledgement. So we just wanted to acknowledge that as one of the controversies.
The second controversy relates to claims that Zevin, who has Korean and Jewish ancestry, is a Zionist. So that is, holds Jewish nationalist beliefs and is pro-Israel and anti-Palestine. So from what we can find, we know that Zevin has spoken in front of an organization that has expressed Zionist views, but to the best of our knowledge, she has not personally expressed these views herself, nor has she spoken against the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, some people are choosing not to read or promote her works due to this suspicion, which I think, given what's happening in Gaza, is understandable.
Yeah, it is. So we are going ahead with a review today, and we are focusing on the book itself rather than further speculating about Zevin's personal beliefs or motivations. However, we acknowledge that it is impossible to do this purely in a vacuum. We do welcome a constructive discussion around this topic, and we want to emphasise that we both support a ceasefire in Palestine. So, shall we get started with part 1, which is our non-spoiler discussion and overall thoughts?
Let's do it.
The main characters of T3 are Sam Mazer and Sadie Green. These two characters meet in a hospital setting. Sam is there after a quite life-changing injury caused by a car accident. Sadie is there because her older sister is undergoing chemotherapy. They happen to come across each other in a kind of gaming, children-friendly space, start playing games together, and it's the first time that Sam speaks properly since the accident as well, as a result of their friendship. So I really loved these scenes between the two of them as children. I thought it was very sweet to see how their relationship developed and how they bonded over video games, in particular, I think Super Mario, sort of the more arcadey older versions of Mario. However, their friendship does end up having a bit of a foundation of mistrust, because we learn that Sadie starts logging the hours she spends with Sam as an act of community service ahead of her bat mitzvah. And although she truly does value him as a friendship, she doesn't quite understand that friendship and you can't conflate friendship and community service. So when Sam finds out about this, understandably, he's devastated and filled with rage at Sadie, and there's a massive rift in their friendship, and they don't sort of rekindle until university, where they happen to stumble across each other once again.
As the summary says, they run across each other in a train station. I want to say run, but Sam pretty much like yelled her name across the station to try and get her attention.
With an old in-joke as well. Sadie Green, you have died of dysentery, which is a reference to, I believe, an old Oregon Trail game that Sadie used to play with her sister.
Which, did you ever play that game?
No, I hadn't heard of it before this book, actually. Had you played it?
No, I have heard of it before, but I've never played it. So, yeah, there's a lot of titles in this book that I have heard of before, but I've never played. So, They talk after that joke, and then Sadie gives Sam the game that she was not developing, but she had created for her class in MIT, which is the solution game. You know, after playing that, Sam, I was going to use the word obsessed, but I think that's not quite the right word. Like, he decided that he wanted to make a game with her.
Sam and his roommate Marks play the game and find it brilliant. As we mentioned at the start of the episode, this is a game that is centered around the Holocaust. So briefly, I suppose, the players are assembling widgets as part of the game, and they can sort of exchange tokens or something within the game to learn more about the factory that they're working in. But if they don't, they eventually learn that they're being complicit in the Holocaust. Sam has some constructive feedback about the game, but generally thinks the idea is quite brilliant. Their friendship, I suppose, rekindles, and they decide to start working on a game together, which turns into a game called Ichigo, which it becomes extremely successful in a pop culture phenomenon over time. So they work extremely hard over a number of months, including with Marks, Sam's roommate. Marks is probably my favourite character in the whole book.
Same. He's just so pure.
I know. He's such a sweetheart. Very likeable character, and he's kind of a moral compass and a good friend to both of them, despite, I suppose, not often being valued by Sam in particular.
Yes.
I'd say, but more of that in the spoilers section.
Yeah.
Let's just say he does get called an NPC at times. He's not really a point of view character in the same way that the others are.
No, but he's an important leg of the tripod.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm curious why he's named Marks, because the first, like, I think I said to you in a message, the first few times he was mentioned, I was like, what has Karl Marx got to do with this story? What? Because I had never heard that
we
name.
Get an explanation.
I had never heard that name in any other context, but Karl Marx. So anyway,
throughout the book, video games are, of course, really integral to the friendship between Sam and Sadie. So both as their business, after the success of Ichigo, they, alongside Marks, create a company called Unfair Games, which sort of develops into a full video game company and is very successful. But also it's the foundation of their friendship, a source of bonding, a source of coping for both of them at various points in the book. For example, Sam, who is affected by chronic pain and has a physical disability, which is a consequence of the car accident he was in as a child, he kind of uses games as a bit of an escape. So there's a quote from Sam: "Sometimes I would be in so much pain, the only thing that kept me from wanting to die was the fact that I could leave my body and be in a body that worked perfectly for a while. Better than perfectly, actually, with a set of problems that were not my own."
I think we see this later in the book as well, that another character escapes into a video game, but we'll chat about that in the spoiler section.
Yeah. Yeah. And at times, video games are also the only thing that's holding their friendship together. So their friendship and the two of them, they sort of, come together and deviate at various times as the novel progresses in terms of how close they are, how much they trust each other. They have this sort of almost frenemy-like relationship at times. And part of that, I think, is because of the early mistrust. There's Sadie's betrayal of Sam, sort of right at the outset of their friendship. There's also issues that Sadie has with Sam as the book progresses, which we'll touch on later. But at times, it's literally the only thing that kind of keeps them in each other's orbit is the role of video games.
Yeah.
What did you think of their friendship overall?
I can see why it's called a love story, but not a romance, because it's such a unique sort of relationship where I don't think if they didn't share that sort of love for video games, or that, what do you call it, creative synergy, I suppose, then it's almost like maybe their lives would not be parallel at all. But is this a spoiler to quote Sadie to say, what is it, lovers are common, but real creative collaborations are rare? And I thought that was really interesting, because you can see that they need each other in various ways across their lives, but it's a very strange, not strange, but unique kind of relationship.
Yeah, that's very true.
How did you find that friendship?
Well, I found them both infuriating as individuals at times, probably Sam more so than Sadie. But I just really love stories about platonic friendships that have complications. So I guess we don't see a lot of it compared to stories about romantic relationships. And maybe that's just the type of fiction that I've come across. But I really like stories where we see how friendships evolve over time and how friendships can be resilient even after going through really tough times, including each person maybe not being the best friend or having unpleasant traits, and sort of working and learning, and the role of forgiveness as well, I think is really important. And so that was something I really enjoyed seeing. And it is quite an epic story. Like if this was a love story, I think we'd describe it as a kind of epic romance. But it's not. It's a story of friendship, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I forgot, while reading it, that it actually spans 30 years.
Yeah, it's quite a long time, isn't it?
Half someone's lifetime, more. I enjoyed watching them both grow as individuals, and how their friendships stumble and grow along with them as well.
Let's also touch on Sam's experience of physical disability, including the role of trauma in his life and chronic pain.
Oh, Sam.
Sam is an asshole at times. Let's acknowledge that.
Yes.
But he's also been through a lot of shit. So, flashing back, we learn that Sam's mother was an actress living in New York. One day, her and child Sam, I think he's maybe 10 or so at the time, they witness a confronting suicide death of a woman who happens to share the name of Sam's mother, Anna Lee. I won't go into details about the death itself. It is described on the page in terms of like methodology. But obviously that's a really horrible thing for them witness. And this is a bit of a catalyst for Sam's mother to move the two of them to California with the promise that, quote, nothing bad will happen to us again, which is a highly foreshadowing line, of course. But then tragedy strikes, of course.
Yes, tragically, Anna dies in a car accident with Sam in the passenger seat. And that's the accident that leaves Sam with significant foot injury.
Yeah, foot injury.
Yeah, so the foot injury leads to a significant number of surgery in the months after the car crash, but then ongoingly many complications, including chronic pain, limited movement into adulthood, and eventually amputation.
Mm.
And of course, I think Sam deals with a lot of grief over the loss of her mother, after which point he was taken into care by his grandparents,
Mm.
who are very lovely by all accounts, but still, it's very,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a traumatic life event. And Sam clearly has complicated feelings about his disability. Throughout the novel, we see him neglecting to use his cane, hiding the extent of his foot injury from other
Mm.
people.
So hiding the pain that he's in, as well as, I
Mm,
suppose, the seriousness of the ongoing complications.
yeah, pushing through really awful pain to get through the day.
Mhm.
Marx is, by all accounts, one of his best friends or one of his closest friend. And Marx didn't know what happened for many years.
Mhm.
It's interesting. He also seems to take risk with his ability. So Sadie would say things like, "Are you sure you can, walk that far and be okay?" Or "The roads are icy."
Mhm.
And then he'd be like, "Yep, it's fine," and then hurts himself.
I think, maybe Sam has internalized
Mm,
a lot of shame over his
mm,
injury and believes that, the best way to go about his life is to push through or pretend that it doesn't exist. His unwillingness to use his cane, for example, which is a mobility
mm,
device that would help
yeah.
him. Part of that might be due to the stigma of disability in society, particularly at the time. I can't remember the exact dates that all of this was happening, but this would have been, I
Mm,
suppose, in the 90s, early 2000s, that he was first experiencing these complications.
yeah.
Unwillingness to get the amputation as well. I don't know. He's just a boy that has like a really high pain threshold, but he's kind of forced to by his physical
Yeah.
injury and also the trauma that he's been through. And I think
Yeah.
this is a big theme for a lot of the characters in the books, is really not talking about what they're experiencing, not disclosing the extent of their trauma, and sort of internalizing things and keeping a lot of things secret.
Absolutely. And there's this layer of class, I suppose, with it as well, because Sam just, for the first part of the book, he's poor. He can't afford medical care for his pain. So I think there were times where he would just push on even though the foot was bleeding.
Yeah.
And Marx would look at it. And actually, I can't remember if I'm making this up or if it's in the book, but someone like Marx who is wealthy, has the resources, would
For the
just go,
insurances and so on.
yeah, would just
Yeah.
go to hospital and get that looked at. But Sam would not. And I do wonder if part of it is because he lives in the US and he
Mm-hmm.
can't afford healthcare.
Class is quite a overarching, well,
Mm.
it might not be the most, I suppose, overt theme in the book, but it's definitely something that affects the characters. It's just kind of an ongoing tension at times throughout the book.
Yeah. And there's this intersection of racial identity and class that each of our three main characters experience. So Sam is
Mm.
Korean, half Jewish. Sadie is Jewish slash white American. I
Yeah.
think we want to describe it that way. Yeah. And Marx is Japanese slash white American as well.
Mm.
Sam, as we said, was raised by his grandparents after his mother's death and would be considered working class, while Sadie and Marx came from money.
Hmm.
And I think between Sam and Marx, that's quite obvious. They become roommate, and Marx sort of makes all these decisions that are nothing to him really financially. And so they both move into this bigger apartment, and Marx essentially covers Sam's rent. Or he would notice that Sam doesn't have a coat and he would just buy a
Mm.
new one or and give Sam his old one, things like that.
Which I suspect is one of the reasons why there's, uh, Sam has this kind of resentment towards Marx at various
Yes.
points throughout the book, but I think that's maybe one of the contributing factors.
Yeah. And I suppose in comparison to Sam, Mark seems to have it easy. He's very, handsome. He's handsome,
Mm.
just, well, described as handsome. We'll take the book's
Yeah.
word for it.
Handsome, charming, confident,
Yeah. Loved by a
able
lot of
bodied.
people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where I suppose Sam is spiky in comparison to Mark's. But even between Sam and Sadie, when they were children, there were comments about how Sadie's from the rich side of town and that's why she was doing charity work, and Sam was her charity.
Should we also talk about Sam's cultural appropriation speech?
Yes.
Yeah. So for context, there's a section of the book where Sam is promoting Ichigo. So he'd only be in his, I guess, early 20s at this time
Yeah.
point. He's quite
Mhm.
young, but he becomes a bit of a global sensation, becomes quite well known, is doing the interview circuit, the promotional circuit, as the game is quite successful. And Ichigo is a game that is inspired by many Japanese elements. The main character, Ichigo, is a young boy. I think he's maybe 4 years old or so.
He becomes, I think initially they were non-binary and then
Yeah. Yeah.
becomes a young boy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And he's Japanese. Much of the artwork is inspired by, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Hokusai, and The Wave being his most famous work, which is also featured on the cover of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. And there's a point in an interview where, just a random interviewer character basically asks him about his thoughts on cultural appropriation. I'll read out Sam's reply because I think it's important to sort of present this in context. So just bear with me, it's a little bit of a longer quote. The alternative to appropriation is a world in which artists only reference their own cultures. And the interviewer says that's an oversimplification of the issue. And Sam says, the alternative to appropriation is a world where white European people make art about white European people with only white European references in it. Swap African or Asian or Latin or whatever culture you want for European. A world where everyone is blind and deaf to any culture or experience that is not their own. I hate that world, don't you? I'm terrified of that world, and I don't want to live in that world. And as a mixed race person, I literally don't exist in it. My dad, who I barely knew, was Jewish. My mum was an American-born Korean. I was raised by Korean immigrant grandparents in Koreatown, Los Angeles. And as any mixed race person will tell you, to be half of two things is to be whole of nothing. And by the way, I don't own or have a particularly rich understanding of the references of Jewishness or Koreanness, because I happen to be those things. But if Ichigo had been fucking Korean, it wouldn't be a problem for you, I guess.
Mm.
We had some mixed responses to this speech. And I'll just note, like, cultural appropriation isn't an overarching theme in this book.
No.
However, I did want to touch on our responses to this.
Yeah, because this was one of the points of the book where I messaged you and I was like, we need to talk about this.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was something that stuck with me the first time I read it as well.
Yeah. I think that line, to be half of two things is to be whole of nothing, is quite striking. I'm not biracial, but I'm in a diaspora. And that line gets to that feeling of like, well, you're not this and you're not that because you're something different entirely. And so where do you fit? So that's a lovely line. And I think it's worth noting that Seven herself is biracial. So that probably comes from a real place.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the rest of that speech,
yeah. And look, I think we both agree with some of the points being raised. For example, being from one race or culture doesn't automatically make you an expert in that race or culture. And it is important to try to understand and learn about other cultures and to expose yourself to art and media from cultures beyond your own. But I think the overarching sentiment is where it doesn't quite sit very well with us.
No, it's just, it oversimplifies what cultural appropriation is and what harm it does and how it ties into colonialism and all that. I think it's statements like this that you go like, is this the character or is this the author? And because it's just left there, and it's like Sam gets the final word in this interview and you're like, well, that should be challenged a bit more, but maybe this is not the medium for it.
Yeah. And I guess we're not, saying that we think the game created within the book Ichigo is offensive or culturally appropriative or culturally appreciative. Like, we know the characters did quite a bit of research in going into it, but it doesn't look like they were consulting with Japanese video game creators or artists or anything like that either. So whether or not that particular game is appropriative is, I suppose, not my major concern. My major concern is, I guess, the message that's coming from this speech. Yeah. Anyway.
Yes, that's just something I think that was Interesting. Yeah.
Definitely interesting. But let's pivot and maybe just
Mm,
talk about Sadie a little bit more,
yes.
including her experiences with depression and her experience of being in a toxic relationship.
Yeah.
So Sadie is, of course, the other main character in this book. There's another main-ish side character called Dove. I believe that's how his
Mm.
name was pronounced in the audiobook. So I think there's a couple of ways to pronounce that name, but I think that's correct in this instance. Dove is Sadie's teacher, professor, I guess,
Lecture. Yeah.
lecturer at MIT in
Mhm.
the video game development course that she's
Yeah.
taking. And he's quite a well-known, experienced, powerful video game developer. He's quite
Mm.
successful. He's got a famous game or two under his belt.
Yeah.
And Dove has, I suppose, at best, a unique approach to teaching. At worst, a highly inappropriate
Yes.
form of teaching. So
Yes.
he's very critical and harsh towards the students. He's also just very, I guess, colloquial and sweary with them.
Mm.
He, talks about topics in his classes that I don't think are appropriate to be talking about. Um,
Very much the sort of guy who would say, "You're not like other girls."
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's kind of the approach that he takes with Sadie as well.
Yeah.
So there's only, just I guess in terms of the power differential as well, Dove is about, I
Mm.
think, maybe 10 years older,
Yeah.
maybe late 20s at the time when Sadie's in her early 20s. Look, basically, he kind of takes Sadie under his wing after she presents Solution, which he thinks is quite brilliant
Mm.
and dark.
Mhm.
And then the abuse of power eventually leads to them having a college teacher/student relationship. Gross. Which,
Mm.
how would you describe this relationship at the start? I suppose
Well,
like it's an affair as well. So he's
he's
married,
married. Yeah.
yeah, with a kid.
I can see how Sadie would fall into it. Like, it's very exciting when someone with that much.
Flattering as well for someone
Mm.
that powerful to be interested in you.
Yes, absolutely. And he's not going after her for her looks as well. Like, he's going after her for her brain and, her skills, which she also values very much. So
Hmm.
being noticed in that way is quite intoxicating.
Particularly as
Um,
being one of the only two women in that class as well.
yeah.
So feeling like singled out and special compared to the
Mhm.
others.
Yep.
So I can
I
see
think,
why
yeah.
why he might target her and why she might fall for him.
Mm.
But it starts off not great, and then they kind of break up and get back together, and eventually the relationship also turns sadomasochistic. We know we're not anti BDSM, we're not anti
No, no.
kink, but it's definitely portrayed in a way where it's not, I suppose, always consensual. So
Yeah.
Dove is definitely pushing the lines of consent and at times acting in a way that is definitely, uh, beyond what she has consented to. So yeah, it is more of like a domestic violence framing.
Yeah. And add a layer to this is that Dove became a producer on Ichigo.
Yep.
So then there's that financial, I think he contributed financially slash he's a mentor in their company, which adds
Yeah.
that power imbalance as well.
Yep. And he lets them
Yeah.
use the Ulysses engine, which is integral to the development of the game too.
Mm.
So Sadie's professional success becomes dependent on Dove's contribution and his willingness to support the project as well, which adds another layer to the power imbalance.
It's just all gross.
Yeah.
Like, anyway, they did break up eventually, or
The first time they broke up.
yes, they broke up a few times, but the first time they broke up, Sadie falls into a period of depression. We don't see this from her perspective. We see it from
Mm.
Sam's. She's portrayed as having low energy, no motivation, spending all day in bed, not eating, not
Mm.
not doing any of the things that she would normally do.
Not showering, not looking after herself, really.
Mm,
Mm.
yeah.
Not showing up to class as well. I'll just flag that one of the things I really did like about Sam's character is his perseverance in trying, at least, to
Mm.
get Sadie out of depressive periods by being there and being persistent, even if Sadie's pushing him away and he feels uncomfortable by doing so. So at first, so this first time that she's experiencing this period of depression and that they haven't really rekindled their friendship yet. This is Marx's suggestion. So I quite like this analogy where he recommended treating her like a Tamagotchi. So to keep going around to her apartment, to get her to shower, to talk, to go for a walk, to keep checking in on her, even if she's resistant at first, to just be there. And then if that doesn't work, he suggested telling her, encouraging her to get professional help. And if that didn't work, telling her parents. So I quite, it might have been Marx's suggestion, but it was Sam that enacted the plan.
Yeah.
And we'll touch on this in the spoiler section as well, but this happens again to a degree later in the book as well, where Sam is quite integral towards Sadie's well-being, but in quite a different way.
Yeah.
So I think that covers some of the main themes of the book. But before we go into the spoilers, let's cover our overall reviews of the book, or our overall impressions. So what did you think?
Overall, I actually quite like this book. Probably not as much as you do, but
spoilers.
Yeah. I have this thing about really hype books where I start from a position of skepticism. Like, I immediately don't trust that it's as good as everyone. Like, I trust your opinion and your hype, but it's like when a book becomes...
Well, we know we overlap, right?
Yes. Yes. But when a book is this popular, I'm like, what's marketing and what's, the actual quality of the book, sort of thing. And I think that was the position I started from when I started reading this. But I found the book really compelling and really easy to read. And there are moments in it that made me stop and think about what's going on. I also really like the complexity of the characters. As much as I struggle with Sam, I think you're meant to struggle with Sam. Though I did wonder if one particular revelation about him and what he might have done to Sadie put me entirely offside with him. And then I just couldn't recover from it.
Yeah. Well, neither could Sadie.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that coming up.
But it's this weird thing where I'm like, in my head, I really enjoyed it, but I didn't feel, well, for most of it, I felt sort of an emotional distance between myself and the characters. And I still can't quite describe why. It may have to do with this prose, because it sort of feels, I don't know what you would call it, but it's a particular point of view where it's like the narrative voice is the author's voice. Because they would make references to be like, but we'll see this down the track, or, that sort of thing. And it's not, we're in the character's head, but like being narrated by someone else.
Yeah.
I think
it's like an omnipotent third person narration or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it's called.
Yeah, potentially. And I think maybe that's part of the distance with it. I read Gabrielle Sevin's Young Jane Young, and I felt sort of the same, that I really enjoyed the book, but I was never connected. I was never fully connected with the character. So maybe it's just the writing and it's just not quite for me. Or,
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Like, it is for me. Like, I'm saying this as if I'm about to rate it really badly. I'm rating it 3.5, which to me, average is 2.5. So this is like well above average. Anyway, what about you? Tell us more about your love for it.
So I can't deny my emotional reaction to this book. I love the imperfect characters, the nostalgia. Like, I would never call myself a gamer, quote unquote, but I have played many of the games that are referenced in this book, or at least in a casual way. And I just loved the flashback side of things and the nostalgia. As I flagged before, I really like the focus on friendship and platonic friendships, and also just the way that the book uses fantasy worlds to illustrate issues with relationships, well-being, and so on. So my only criticisms are, I did feel it's a bit slow-paced, and I feel that the storytelling could have been a bit tighter. And part of that is just my reading preferences changing as I'm getting older. I'm a little bit less patient with longer-winded books these days. And also, I don't agree with all of the time jump choices. So there are moments that are kind of skipped over that I really wish were on the page. I do think it works overall, but I do wonder if maybe that would have been more of an emotional punch at times if we had seen certain scenes that are just kind of referenced back.
Yeah.
But I'm still going to give it a 4.5 out of 5 because I can't deny I really loved it. So, yeah, as a piece of art and a piece of fictional work, I think it just scratches my brain in a good way.
Yeah. Wonderful. And it's not a mental health book.
No.
Like, it's not focused on a particular mental health theme, but I do believe that the ones that it portrayed, the ones that we've discussed, are well written. Um,
I think they're just really good characters, like really good
yeah.
characterization, especially considering they are third person point of view as well. Like we have such a good insight into what makes them tick, the experiences that have shaped them, the thought processes and the way that they see the world as well. I just think it's really well done.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I do think they could have all benefited from therapy.
All right, shall we move on to spoilers? So we touched earlier on the foundations of Sam and Sadie's friendship, but we did want to talk about some time points where their friendship deteriorates or struggles. So there is one particular time point where the characters are developing Ichigo and they're quite young and they don't really have a lot of resources yet. The company hasn't been developed fully and they're thinking about gaming engines, and I don't really understand what a gaming engine is, but it is important to the development of the game. Sam basically pushes for them to approach Dove for the Ulysses gaming engine. However, through various circumstances, eventually Sadie learns that Sam must have actually known that she had a history with Dove rather than being, I suppose, innocent to their relationship. And this is really shocking for her, and she doesn't say anything to him at the time, but it definitely drives a wedge between them and this extreme resentment. From memory, after approaching Dove for Ulysses, that was a point where Sadie and Dove got together a second time. And then that kind of catalyzed the particularly unhealthy part of their relationship where she was, and that really messed her up, understandably. That really had a massive effect on her.
Yeah. And I suppose it feels to her that Sam has pushed her into this relationship with some knowledge that they had a history. That's her perspective of it anyway.
And I'll just quote here in a bit of a paraphrased and tightened way. She says, "It was absolutely a betrayal. She let herself think Sam was her friend, but Sam was no one's friend. She had made excuses for him, his absentee father, the death of his mother, his injury, his poverty. But what if her mistake had been in imbuing Sam with emotions and sentiments that he was incapable of feeling?" So it really damages how she sees Sam to learn about this.
Yeah, and I suppose I pondered that question of hers for a bit, like what's trauma for Sam and what's just his personality?
Where do you draw the distinction between the impacts of
Yeah.
trauma and someone's, I guess, moral compass in a way?
He seems to be very, like, I don't know if it's, I don't know the right word, not rational, goal oriented. Like, he's not socially motivated. Like, he doesn't do things to please people. He does things because, it makes sense to him, which could be trauma. It would make sense that he has had to toughen up and develop tough skin, I suppose, to survive significant emotional and physical
That's
pain.
true. Yeah.
But I don't know. I guess there's limited hints about that from Sam's perspective, that he just,
Yeah. A lot of that is just Sadie speculating about
yeah,
his motivations and
yeah.
yeah.
Like, from his perspective, it's often just like, well, we have to go and get things done. So it could be both. It could be both
Yeah.
trauma and just his personality.
Yeah. And then this all becomes confounded by the fact that Sam kind of becomes the face of Ichigo, which is their first successful game, and takes a lot of credit. Further leads to this rift in their friendship, which already had that shaky foundation we talked about earlier. And this is illustrated by their second game after Ichigo and Ichigo 2, which is called Both Sides, which is kind of like this dual world game where there's like a real side and a fantasy side, and it switches between the two perspectives. And Sam and Sadie work separately on the two different parts of the game. So Sam works on the real side in this like Maple World town, and Sadie works on the fantasy side, which is Maya's Landing, I think, which is a fantasy setting. Even though they might kind of work separately, the whole thing just doesn't really work together, and the game ends up being quite criticized, which I thought was, a nice illustration of how their friendship separates and they're not really working in the same.
Sadie didn't want to do Ichigo 2, but it made commercial sense. And then Sadie pushed for this game to happen, and then it tanked. And I think at some point Sam was like, well, you don't know what you're talking about, or something to that along those lines.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, in any case, like the idea of the game was
Yeah.
Sadie's,
Mm-hmm.
right? And she took it really personally when the game didn't do very well. So
Mm-hmm.
even though part of the game ended up developing into quite a successful online role-playing game, she took the hit really hard. And again, this feeds into the idea that Sam takes credit for the good sides of the work
Mm-hmm.
and she gets criticized for the things that don't work out so well.
Yeah. And I think I can really see both sides of that
Mm.
argument in that, like, Sadie didn't want to do the promotional work
No, she didn't.
attached, yeah, to Ichigo. And because of her resentment, perhaps couldn't see that promotional work is hard work. But then Sam also didn't do enough to actively give Sadie the credit that she
No.
deserved either.
Yeah. It's not fully his fault that the media sort of latched onto him as the face of unfair games as well.
Yeah. Because I think what we haven't mentioned is that Ichigo's gait is kind of based on Sam's, and then because Ichigo is coded to be Japanese and Sam is half Asian.
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of the media sort of see him as being Ichigo. He's the face of
Yeah.
Ichigo.
Yeah. And then because Sadie doesn't want to be public facing, it sort of exacerbates that cycle as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, again, Sam could just actively bring up her name a lot more.
Yep. um, and a couple of other points. So, you know, as the novel progresses, they do spend a lot of time together, but obviously as they're working together, but their friendship is kind of simultaneously deep and shallow. So they never have, or they rarely have quite like real or in-depth conversations,
Mm,
but they share so much of their lives together that they can like predict what the next person is going to say and that kind of thing. What is an in-depth friendship versus just a working relationship?
and we also eventually learn that a contributing factor to Sadie's depression was having an abortion that
Mm,
she never told anyone about
mm.
until she told Sam one day, many,
Yeah.
many years later.
Yeah. So that doesn't come up for a very, very long time. So again,
Yeah.
you know, Sadie, like Sam, keeps a lot of things to herself and they don't air their grievances. And, you know, one of the reasons why why it was such a bad idea for her to get back together with Dove was
Mm,
because of the abortion, which she didn't tell Dove about. And,
yeah.
you know, Sam wasn't to know that when he kind of pushed her in this pathway, which ended up getting her back together with him as well. I don't know if things would have been different if they'd been more open with each other.
Well, and then at some, can't remember what point,
Mhm.
but Sadie and Marks got together.
Yeah, I believe it's about halfway through the
Mm,
book where Sadie and Marks are on a business trip and get together for the first time.
mm,
And they don't tell anyone for a while, but Sam eventually picks it up after he notices, I guess, like an intimate
yeah.
gesture from like between them at an office party.
Mm,
And this leads to a lot of jealousy from Sam. I don't think he was really into Sadie that way previously, but it's something about that, like seeing Sadie with somebody else, seeing
mm,
Sadie with Marks, I
yeah.
should say. Like, I don't know if it would have been the case if she'd just been dating someone random.
Yeah.
But something about seeing them together, which I guess just ignites Sam to feel that he does actually have feelings for Sadie. And it's this real jealousy that comes on board. So even though their friendship is ultimately platonic, they never get
Mm,
together,
yeah.
which I can say because we're in spoiler section.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is definitely this time point where he does have feelings for her, or at least he believes he does because she's been taken away by his best friend.
It almost feels like he thinks they're meant to be together.
Yeah.
And so he thinks he has feelings for her that way, but ultimately, maybe he does. And then it was just never returned.
Yeah.
Um, it's a bit of like, she's my best friend and you can't have her, you know?
Yeah.
Because essentially, Sam got very drunk after he found out and said to Marks, you're an NPC, you don't matter, or you're not
Mhm.
supposed to matter. And I was
And
like,
for those who are
"What?"
not gamers, I should
Yeah.
mention NPC means non-playable character. So it's quite a dismissive thing to call somebody because it's like you're just a side character that doesn't matter, that's not fully formed.
Mm, which is a terrible thing to say to someone
Yeah.
who's basically, whether Sam like it or not, Marx has given him a lot of support over the years,
Hmm.
essentially given him housing for many
Yeah.
years.
And clearly loves him as well,
Mm,
you know, as a close friend or almost like a brother at times too.
yeah.
And is an integral part of their company. Like I don't remember exactly what his role is. It was probably like a sort of chief operations officer or something
Yeah.
like that, where he just kind of looks after everything.
Mm.
I don't know. Sam's very hurt and he kind of externalizes his feelings in
Yeah,
that
and
way.
yeah, I think Sam sees him and Sadie as a duo,
Mhm.
but throughout the story, I see them as a trio. So it's that tripod thing. Like without Marks, I don't think they would have worked for so long and so well.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
Marx is such a stabilizing force in their relationship. He's like a go-between, or,
Mm,
he smooths over things. He can talk to each of them when they're feuding with each other or having a
mm.
tough time.
So when Marx is removed from the equation, we can see them destabilize very quickly.
Yeah.
Mm.
So we should talk about Marx's death,
Uh,
sadly. So just
only the
to,
good die young.
oh, poor Marx. So yeah, Marx unfortunately does die about 3/4 of the way through the book. So
Mm,
for background, what led to that? So Unfair Games decided to incorporate queer relationships and marriage into their online role-playing game, Maple World.
mm,
Sam has a quote where he says, virtual worlds can be better than the actual world. They can be more moral, more just, more progressive, more empathetic, and more accommodating of difference. And if they can, shouldn't they be? It becomes a kind of quite socially progressive and sort of headline grabbing thing that queer relationships and queer marriage
mm.
is incorporated into this.
Yeah.
But then the Unfair Games office one day is attacked by two shooters. So their motivation is basically, one is angry that his wife left him for a woman that she met in the game, and they take out their anger on the developers. So they are actually after Sam, who is the face of the game.
Mm,
Um, but Sam and Sadie are away on like a business trip. So it's Marx that's holding down the fort. And he does his best. Like, he actually does a phenomenal job at
yeah.
holding them off and trying to de-escalate and keeping the employees safe. Like, he handles the situation, I think, a lot better than I
Yeah.
would have
Yeah.
in that scenario.
Yeah.
But yeah, unfortunately, it does lead to him being shot, and he's kind of kept alive in an induced coma, I believe, for a few weeks,
Mm,
but
yeah.
he's unable to be, the like recovery becomes not possible. So he ends up dying. Another character, who's a side character, I think his name's Anthony,
Yeah.
also is
Mm,
shot too, but he recovers.
yeah.
So naturally, that's a big turning point for
Mm,
the major characters in this book.
absolutely. And it's like the gun violence itself, it's horrible to say, but they live in the US. So the fact that it was part of the story is almost less shocking to me than what happened after. That it was Marx who died and how it impacted everyone. But also, like, as much as I love Marx and I hate that he died, it
From
sort
a
of makes
storytelling perspective,
yeah,
it's like,
from the
yeah, I
story,
get it.
from a reader and a writer's perspective, I'm like, all right, that makes sense because then that accelerates like the story and it
Yeah.
forces the characters to grow up in a different way. So otherwise they would have just settled into this stable life and stable dynamic between the three of them. Yeah, it was all very sad.
Yeah.
Mm.
Rereading that chapter, like, I started crying
Oh,
before the chapter because I knew it was coming up, and I'm like,
yeah.
oh my God. Because the first time I read it, I obviously didn't know that was
Yeah.
going to happen. I hadn't
Mhm.
been spoiled. But the second time, I was just like emotionally preparing myself for it. And I was just weeping all the way through the chapter where
Yeah.
that happens. So
Yeah.
again,
Yeah. I mean, the chapter about Mark's dying is written quite beautifully.
it is.
I love that comparison between dying in real life and dying in a game. Like,
Yeah.
she can never die in a game. Yeah. Um, but Sadie's grief is particularly
Mm.
full on, I suppose, during this time
It's a
because
complicated grief, I'd
yeah,
say.
because she's
And
pregnant. Yeah.
yeah, she learns that she's pregnant to Marx,
Yeah.
and her grief also leads to another period of
Mm.
depression. And we know that Sadie seems to be prone to these periods of depression as well. I don't think she
Mm.
really has coping skills
Yeah.
to kind of work through that. And, there's many reasons why people might be prone to depression.
Yeah.
Marx's death is a major triggering factor for
Mm.
this.
Yeah.
And she basically withdraws from the company without actively resigning. So she spends a lot of time at home, isn't meeting her responsibilities, is just almost uncontactable for a long time. And we don't see a lot of this from Sadie's point of view either. We see it from Sam's point of view. And Sam's grieving too. You know, Sam himself has been through very significant grief, but I suppose his grief follows more of a traditional timeline, I guess. Like it doesn't sort of escalate into a period of depression in the same way it does for Sadie. So Sam is able to return to work, to hold down the fort, to try to get the office back into something, you know, that can continue, because people's livelihoods do rely on the office. They do rely on the company continuing.
Yeah.
There's a really awful scene where Sam is trying to clean up Marx's blood from the office carpet, I think, and there's like a bullet hole in the wall, and he's just trying his best to deal with it, and it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this little snippet of their interaction where Sam says to Sadie, "You can't ignore me in our company and everything that came before. Everything isn't over because Marx is dead." And Sadie tells him that she can't go back to the office. And Sam says, "Then you're weaker than I thought." Which is like, Sam, you are mean sometimes, but
He
also,
is. I get why he's angry though, because he's, you know,
he's doing it.
shouldering the responsibility and doesn't quite understand why she can't function in the same way that he can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, it's one of those things where you can see that they're both struggling and maybe not able to support each other in that point.
Yeah.
And I think a part of the fallout between them is because this seems mean to put it in this way, but in Sadie's mind, it was Sam who was supposed to die.
Well, he was, in a way. That's who the gunmen explicitly were targeting.
And there's this scene where Sam... This is one of those things where it would have been good to see it as it was happening instead of it being a recollection.
Yeah.
But there's a scene where Sam recall Sadie kind of like hitting him on the chest and saying, you know, it was supposed to be you. And that Sam internally agreed with her, which I thought was quite heartbreaking. And then he recalled that she apologized for it. The apology wasn't as heartfelt as the accusation, which again is quite heartbreaking, the whole
really
thing.
Is.
Yeah.
But we do end up seeing Sam, I guess, eventually manage to pull her out of her grief, or at least help her process her grief through time in a more distanced way and without Marx to guide him. He does this the way that he knows how, which is by building another game. So this time he builds an Oregon Trail RPG. So, of course, Oregon Trail was, you know, something that they had this connection to as children. And I believe it's like an extension of Maple World or something like that. And Sadie ends up joining and spending a lot of time in the game and sort of building a foundation for herself and a character in the game, and befriends characters and eventually has a relationship with a character, which is not, I guess, the relationships within that game, they're more like friendships, like they're not really sort of romantic relationships. But we eventually learned that multiple characters that were befriending Sadie were actually Sam, which she feels betrayed by at the start, which I can understand.
Yeah.
But eventually, I guess, comes around to this idea that he built a game for her to help her. And I don't know, I just found it very sweet. Like, it's kind of messed up, but it's also kind of sweet. I feel complicated about it. But, you know, this happens over, I think, a long period of time. I don't recall what it says in the books. I read a synopsis which said this happened over 3 years. I don't think it was quite that long, but it was...
No, I think it might have been 3 years in the game.
Yeah, maybe 3 years
she
in
was
the game.
pregnant. The character was pregnant for a ridiculous amount of time. Yeah.
Yes. She cuts off contact with Sam again after this happens, but I think it kind of leads her on a path of processing and just managing life when, you know, she's a new mum. Marx isn't there to be the dad. She gets support from her family, but I don't know, she's very isolated at that time, and I think this game really helps her cope and process. So their friendship does eventually rekindle, and then I think it kind of puts them on the pathway to making games together again. So there was a quote earlier in the book where Sadie says, "You said we would forgive each other no matter what we did or what we said." So I think that's kind of a testament to the power of their friendship. Even if it's imperfect, even if there are times where they drift apart or they hurt each other, they are stronger together.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where the book ends.
Yeah. I think that quote is interesting because ultimately it's true. But I think when they said it the first time, let's promise that we would forgive each other no matter what,
Mm.
they were quite naive in thinking what that forgiveness would look like as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yep.
obviously there are some things that could not be brushed aside that easily. So I think the fact that it took that long for them to come back together is quite poignant, I suppose, but
Yeah.
also realistic.
Yeah.
All right, what are your favorite moments? You go first. Mm,
I'll keep it brief, but I love the scenes with Sam and Sadie as children bonding over Mario and other games in the hospital.
mm,
And I guess it's not a favorite moment per se, but the chapter involving Marx's death, I just found that so touching, especially the way it's written with a second person point of view. It's the only chapter that's written in second
yeah,
person.
all valid.
Yep.
I love the scenes where Sam and Sadie work together on the games and just
Mhm.
that creative collaboration that you can see the spark fly off between them when they're in that creative zone. I love the scene where Marx took care of Sam after he called Marx an NPC.
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
Marx, you are too good.
Too good for this world.
And this only came to me as we were talking, but I love the last game that Sadie made where she paid homage to Marx. There's this description of a cutscene or an Easter egg of some sort where this actor started a soliloquy or something like that. That reference, how in real life Marx never got to play a leading role when he was
Mm.
part of the university's theater because he's Asian and all the roles are wide. But in this game, he was the leading actor and he got to do this. I think it is a soliloquy. I can't remember, but I thought it was a
Well, I think
lovely.
it's the game. Is it the game Master of the Revels? I think that
Yeah,
they
that one.
create, right? And
Yeah,
then, and
yeah,
yeah, it was very sweet.
yeah. I thought so too. But yeah, those are my favorites.
Great. All right. Well, I think that wraps up our review. So we'll just briefly talk about what to expect in our show notes and the next book that we're covering for book club.
We will be posting some discussion questions in our Facebook group. So if you would like to join in on that, please. I was going to say Google, but that's not what you do on Facebook.
Link in the show notes.
Yes, find the link in the show notes or type Novel Feelings Community into your Facebook search bar.
And then in our detailed show notes on novelfeelings.com, we will link to some mental health resources relating to depression, chronic pain, and grief. We'll also post our book club discussions there too, if you want to check it out.
Yes.
And our next book
Yeah.
is coming up in March.
We will be reading Hospital by Sanya Rushdie. Based on real life events and translated from Bengali, Hospital by Sanya Rushdie is an extraordinary novel that portrays the experience of psychosis and its treatments in an unflinching and understated way, while struggling more broadly with the definition of sanity in our society.
So that wraps us up for today. Thank you so much for listening and joining along with our latest book club season. And we hope you can join us in March for Hospital.
Yes, and if you like us, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Find us online on Instagram, YouTube, and the Story Graph through novel_feelings or search Novel Feelings Community on Facebook.
If we have entertained you or taught you something, please consider buying us a coffee to show your thanks. Link in the show notes. All proceeds go towards making the show stronger and more sustainable. Thank you so much for listening and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Our podcast was recorded on Wurundjeri Land, which is home to both of us in Naarm, Melbourne.
We also acknowledge the role of storytelling in First Nations communities.
Always was,
Always will be
Aboriginal Land.